my fellow Burkinabe. For decades they came to our land, with smiles on their faces and chains in their hands. They thought they could rob us of our gold, our dignity, and our future without consequence. But today the mask has fallen. The Western mining tycoon who stole over $60 billion worth of our gold has been exposed, cornered, and forced to return every bar to the people it belongs to. This is not just a victory for Burkina Faso, it is a warning to every hand that dares to steal.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we bring you a story that shakes the very foundations of the global economic order, a story that will have the West whispering in corridors of power, a story they wish you would never hear. It begins not in the boardrooms of London or New York, but in the proud, dust-red heartlands of Burkina Faso. A land rich not just in minerals, but in the dignity and resilience of its people. For decades, the wealth beneath Africa's soil has been siphoned away, stolen in broad daylight under the banners of investment and partnership. But this time, the script changed. In the shadows of corporate greed, a Western CEO hailed in the media as a visionary. Celebrated in the stock markets as a genius, orchestrated one of the most brazen thefts in recent history. Over $60 billion worth of pure African gold bars spirited away through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. To the world, it looked like a flawless victory for the same colonial machinery that has bled this continent for centuries. But they underestimated one man, a soldier, a strategist, and above all, a son of Africa. He didn't respond with mere outrage. He didn't hold a press conference to issue toothless condemnations. Instead, he moved like the desert wind unseen, unstoppable, and guided by a vision of justice. What followed was a masterclass in outsmarting the oppressor, a chess game played not on the battlefield, but in the very financial systems they built to control us. With precision, patience, and an intelligence network stretching across continents. Not only recovered what was stolen, he turned the theft itself into a weapon that would expose the West's hypocrisy for all the world to see. And tonight you will hear the whole story, how the trap was set. How the CEO, confident in his untouchable power, found himself cornered by the very man he dismissed as just another African president. How Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a pawn, became the checkmate move in a game the West thought they had already won. This is not just about gold. This is about reclaiming the soul of a continent. This is about a message to every African child that our resources, our dignity, and our future will never again be signed away in backroom deals. And so, as the world watches in disbelief and the so-called titans of industry scramble to hide their fear, Captain Ibrahim steps forward, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of a rising Africa. And tonight, the truth will be told.
Welcome to Talk of Africa 360, your source for insightful news, analysis, and thoughtful commentary. If you value informed perspectives and fact-based reporting, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an update. Disclaimer: the content on this channel is based on reliable public sources and credible online information. It is intended strictly for educational and analytical purposes. We do not promote or endorse political violence, hate speech, or any form of discrimination. Our goal is to inform, not to inflame. Thanks for being here. Let's stay informed together.
The dry wind of Ouagadougou carried with it a strange tension on the morning of the announcement. Vendors at the city's central market whispered in hushed tones, their conversations carrying the same question. Is it true? Has the gold come back? Radio sets crackled from roadside kiosks, all tuned to the same station. There was no music that morning, only the stern yet electrifying voice of the anchor. Fellow Africans, history has been made. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, has dealt a blow to Western exploitation the likes of which the continent has not seen in decades. The Western mining tycoon responsible for stealing over $60 billion worth of Burkina Faso's gold bars has been outwitted, exposed, and forced to return the plunder. This is not just news, it is liberation in motion. For months, rumors had swirled through the corridors of power and the dusty streets alike. Massive quantities of gold, enough to change the fate of an entire nation, had quietly disappeared from Burkina Faso's mines. The official export records, provided by the Ministry of Mines in earlier years, always seemed in order when Western corporate auditors checked them. But in reality, beneath the surface of polished reports and PowerPoint presentations, an elaborate theft was underway. The mastermind was Richard Pembroke III, a smug, silver-haired mining magnate from London whose family fortune was built on a century of resource plundering in Africa. For him, Burkina Faso was just another small, manageable African state to be exploited, a place where corrupt politicians in the past could be bribed, records altered, and entire shipments of gold reclassified as copper or iron before disappearing into private vaults in Zurich and Dubai. But Pembroke's calculus failed to account for a soldier named Ibrahim Traoré. The story begins 2 years earlier, when Captain Traoré's intelligence team intercepted strange satellite data. Convoys leaving the Ennahda and Essakane gold sites at night, moving not toward official refineries in Ouagadougou, but west toward hidden airstrips. The shipments were unmarked, the trucks escorted by a mix of private European contractors and armed mercenaries. From these dusty airstrips, private jets would lift off into the night, bound for destinations in the Middle East and Europe. The cargo manifests told one story, the real weight of the shipments told another. Traoré, barely 35 yet already feared by the cartel of Western mining bosses who had run West African gold extraction for decades, decided that open confrontation would not be enough. The theft was too well covered, the bribery network too entrenched. Instead, he launched what his aides later called Operation Arrow, a months-long sting that would not only expose the theft but force the culprits to return every stolen bar. The first step was infiltration. Traoré placed loyal Burkinabe intelligence officers inside Pembroke's own corporate security team. Disguised as drivers, translators, and low-level administrative staff, they collected documents, recorded late-night conversations, and traced the shadow banking networks Pembroke used to launder the gold into legitimate assets. They followed the paper trails to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and traced ownership documents for private vaults hidden beneath luxury hotels in Geneva. The evidence was damning, but Traoré knew that evidence alone would not be enough. Western governments had protected men like Pembroke for generations. Convictions were rare, even when proof was overwhelming. The key was to set a trap so perfect that the CEO's own greed would force him to incriminate himself in front of the entire world. In February of this year, Traoré invited Pembroke to what was billed as a reconciliation summit in Ouagadougou. On paper, it looked like a softening of relations. The Burkinabe government, according to the official invite, was ready to explore avenues for renewed partnership with Pembroke's mining empire after past misunderstandings. Pembroke, ever arrogant, accepted. He arrived in Burkina Faso in a private Gulfstream jet, accompanied by a coterie of lawyers, PR handlers, and a personal chef. The Western media reported it as a diplomatic thaw, but inside the presidential compound, the real plan was unfolding. The meeting room was wired with hidden cameras and microphones. The documents placed in front of Pembroke were not real contracts, but forensic reconstructions of his own criminal ledgers, pages copied from his secret files by Traoré's infiltrators. As the cameras rolled, Traoré's ministers began to read each entry aloud, asking Pembroke to clarify shipment dates, cargo weights, and offshore bank transfers. At first, Pembroke laughed it off. Misunderstandings, gentlemen. Clerical errors. Nothing unusual in international mining. But as the pages turned, the laughter faded. By the 12th page, his lawyers began whispering in frantic tones. By the 21st, Pembroke's face had drained of color. Then came the moment that would be replayed across African television for weeks. Traoré slid a single gold bar across the table, one stamped with Burkina Faso's national seal, recovered from a vault in Switzerland only 2 weeks earlier. The silence in the room was deafening. "Mr. Pembroke," Traoré said, his voice low but unyielding, "this is ours. And so are the other 1.8 million bars you have stolen. You will return them. Not tomorrow, not next week, now." Within hours, the footage was on the air. The shockwave was immediate. From Accra to Nairobi, markets and bus stations erupted in cheers as the images spread. The symbolism was undeniable. For the first time in living memory, an African leader had cornered one of the West's most untouchable resource barons and forced him into public submission. The next days were a whirlwind. Under the threat of an international arrest warrant backed by several non-aligned nations, Pembroke's lawyers arranged for the immediate transfer of the gold from vaults in Switzerland, the UAE, and London back to Burkina Faso. Cargo planes escorted by the Burkinabe military touched down one after another at Ouagadougou International Airport, their holds filled with the gleaming bars that had been missing from the nation's reserves for years. The streets filled with celebration. Women in colorful pagnies danced in the capital's squares, ululating as the gold-laden convoys rolled through town. Musicians improvised new songs about Ibrahim the Lion, who had outwitted the White Snake from London. In rural villages, elders gathered under neem trees to tell the young what had just happened. This is what it looks like when Africa stands up for itself. But the victory was not just emotional, it was strategic. The returned gold instantly transformed Burkina Faso's economic position. With reserves restored, the government announced sweeping plans, debt repayments canceled, foreign aid dependence slashed, and a $15 billion infrastructure program launched to build roads, railways, and renewable energy plants across the country. For the first time, Burkina Faso would fund its own development on its own terms. Western capitals were furious. The British Foreign Office issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern over the circumstances of Pembroke's treatment. The Swiss Banking Association lobbied to protect investor confidence. But these protests fell flat outside Europe. Across the African Union, leaders privately congratulated Traoré. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, government spokesmen hinted that they too had unfinished business with foreign mining companies. Analysts called it a turning point, a moment when the myth of Western untouchability began to crack. Dr. Femi Adeyemi, a Nigerian economist, told our outlet, "For decades, Africans have been told that our wealth is beyond our reach, hidden in systems too complex for us to challenge." Captain Traoré just proved that is a lie. The empire bleeds, and it can be made to bleed more. Back in Ouagadougou, the gold was placed under heavy guard in newly reinforced vaults beneath the central bank. Unlike past governments that had quietly resold recovered resources back to foreign buyers, Traoré pledged that not 1 ounce will leave African soil without fair exchange and mutual benefit. He invited journalists from across the continent to inspect the reserves firsthand, a radical transparency move that sent shivers through the old networks of corruption. In Pembroke, the once untouchable CEO returned to London disgraced, his company's stock price in freefall, his assets frozen in multiple jurisdictions. In a bitter twist, several Western governments that once shielded him from African lawsuits began investigating him for tax evasion and illegal trafficking. Alone and humiliated, Pembroke became the face of a dying era, the last gasp of an empire built on stolen African gold. As this historic chapter closed, the streets of Ouagadougou remained alive with a single, defiant chant: "The gold is ours. The future is ours. Africa will never kneel again." From this day forward, the people of Burkina Faso will remember the man who outsmarted the West at its own game, not with armies, but with patience, cunning, and the unbreakable will of a continent reclaiming its destiny.
As reactions continue to pour in from across the continent, one thing is clear. Africa is demanding respect, sovereignty, and accountability. Was this just a diplomatic misstep or a deeper sign of shifting global alliances? We'll be watching closely. If you found this story important, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, unfiltered African news. This is Talk of Africa 360, telling the stories that matter.